Realm presents Royally Yours, Episode 5.
Henry. You can't go in there. Henry looked up at the brick of a man guarding the door. With his hand still halfway toward the knob, he said, "I need the bride. We have an appointment with the jeweler. Mrs. Whittaker took Queen Victoria's blue sapphire tiara out of the vault, and I need to make sure it fits." "I have strict instructions not to let anyone mail into the room." The brick crossed his arms over his broad leather-clad chest. "They're doing lady stuff in there." Henry sighed and dropped his arms. "Lady stuff." "Meredith and Katrina trying on clothes or something." Henry narrowed his eyes at the man. His name was Mike. They'd met a few days before, when pop star Katrina Ledoux showed up for maid of honor duty with her entourage, which included her bodyguard, a 6-foot-something Italian bloke with an uncouth American accent, several visible tattoos, close-cropped black hair, and a scar over his right eyebrow. He was currently wearing black jeans, a white t-shirt, and a well-worn leather jacket that looked soft to the touch, although Henry wouldn't dare, and also it was entirely inappropriate attire for Buckingham Palace. Henry's boss had tasked him with making sure the various visiting Americans behaved themselves in front of the Queen. He had tried to squeeze as much education as he could into the 10 minutes Mike had allowed the day before, but he doubted much had sunk in. Henry could not have this big brute of a man disrespect the sovereign. He could not. He had to stay on task no matter how distracting the bodyguard's bulging muscles were. The part of Henry that was employed by the royal family wanted to shove this man out of the palace doors as fast as possible. But part of him also wanted to climb this guy like a tree. Henry cleared his throat. "She'll be late for the appointment if she doesn't come out in the next 5 minutes. Mike raised an eyebrow. "For a tiara fitting? How hard can it be to fit a tiara? She puts it on her head." Henry let out an exasperated breath. "As for you, I've been meaning to speak with you about your behavior. I don't need etiquette lessons. The Queen's corgis have better manners than you, and I just saw one of them eating flowers in the hallway. This isn't some nightclub in New York. You will be in the presence of the Queen tomorrow. There's a certain standard of behavior that must be adhered to." Mike made a duck's bill with his hand and opened and closed it a couple of times. Henry bristled. He'd had a hell of a day, and this giant man was trying his patience. "I don't have time. I'm going in." "Knock first, buddy." Henry closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Yes, right. Just because he was frustrated, he couldn't abandon his manners. He made a show of knocking politely on the door. There was a peal of girlish laughter. Then Meredith said, "Yes? It's Henry Stockbridge, Miss Bast. I'm here to take you to your next appointment. Be right out." Henry stood staring at the door for a long moment, aware of the watchful gaze of Mike, the bodyguard. They were outside a drawing room that Miss Bast had commandeered as a place to see guests, and there had been a long string of American visitors who clearly had no idea how to behave in the Queen's house. It was like they'd all been pulled off a tour. Polo shirts and fanny packs and all. Henry shuddered at the thought. As the moment stretched on, Henry grew concerned. Was she coming out or not? He pressed close to the door to try to hear what was happening inside. There was an odd metallic squeal, then a thump. "What's going on in there?" Henry shouted. When there was no response, he glanced at Mike. He raised his eyebrows and gestured toward the door. "Something happened. I'm going in." "Yeah, fine, but let me." Mike grasped the doorknob, then said loudly, "Katrina, we're coming in." He pulled open the door and walked inside. Henry followed on his heels, anxiety turning his veins icy. The room was empty. Mike glanced at the sharply dressed man who was wringing his hands in the middle of the room. Henry was cute in a fussy type A way. He wore a purple tie with his conservative grey suit, perhaps a subtle nod at rebellion. Yeah, for all his polite polish, Mike imagined there was a rebel in Henry trying to escape. But Mike couldn't think about that now, because Katrina and Meredith had apparently flown the coop. A blue curtain perfectly matched to the room's upholstery billowed out from a wide-open window. "Holy shit," Mike said. "Well, this is just splendid." Henry said, looking up at Mike. "This is all your fault." "My fault? If you had just let me go in." "Hold it right there, buddy. What if they'd been undressed? Surely that's some kind of violation of protocol or whatever. Katrina pays me good money to keep doors closed. She values her privacy. She pays me because I won't look." Henry frowned. "You serious? Big, burly guy like you? You never sneak a peek?" "I'm a professional." Henry raised his eyebrows and gave Mike a once-over, his gaze settling on Mike's leather jacket. Mike grunted. "Well, let's just say she's not my type." Henry's eyes went wide. "You're gay? You're gay?" Mike raised his eyebrow playfully. "We come in all shapes and sizes." Henry shook himself, perhaps recovering from the surprise. Then he seemed to remember his true purpose and stared out the window. "They're gone. Where did they go?" "I assume out the window." Henry's panic rolled off him in waves that Mike could practically see. Henry started pulling at curtains and searching under furniture, as if Meredith and Katrina were merely hiding. But no, Henry must have known as well as Mike did that the women had left the building, and that was a huge problem. They'd bailed just before the most important day of Meredith's life. Henry was like a housefly buzzing around the room, fidgeting and muttering to himself. But Mike was angry. This was just like Katrina. Though she'd never bailed on a public appearance, she had pulled the window trick once before, when she was trying to escape a meeting with her second ex-husband's divorce attorney. But now was not the time for a disappearing act. Speaking of exes, hadn't Meredith's been spotted in London? Hadn't Mike seen that in one of those trashy papers that morning? Oh no. "I can fix this," Henry was saying. "I can fix this." "How?" "We're the only ones who know she's missing. If I go out there and get her back before anyone notices, everything will be fine. I just have to catch her before anyone knows she's missing or anyone in the press catches on that she's left the palace." Henry started to pace. "I just need to get her back here. It's fine. Nothing is amiss." "Sure, Hank. So what are we standing around here for?" "We?" "You gotta find a royal bride. I gotta find Katrina before she causes too much trouble. Might as well work together. Not to mention I've got a motorcycle." Henry furrowed his brow. "What has that got to do with anything?" "Have you seen the traffic out there? We're obviously not getting anywhere in a car." "All right. Fine. Let's go. We've wasted enough time." Henry buzzed out of the room, so Mike ran after him. They seemed to be headed for a side door. Mike had cased the place when he'd first arrived, to get the lay of the land, which was how he'd initially earned Henry's somewhat adorable scorn. He'd walked down the wrong corridor, apparently, but the place was so big, it was easy to get lost. Mike had only the vaguest idea of where they were now. But as soon as they stumbled into the sunlight, he recognized that they were crossing a terrace on the south side of the building. When they reached the road surrounding the palace, he saw an old truck driving slowly up the path outside the door. Henry ran toward it, waving his hands to flag it down. Did you see anyone go past?" Mike walked up beside him and peered into the car. A tan guy in a dirt-stained shirt sat behind the wheel. The man seemed to consider them for a second, but then said, "They went toward the mews." He jerked his chin toward the shrubbery. "Let's go." Henry took off again and shouted over his shoulder, "Thank you! Let's keep this to ourselves, shall we?" Then he broke into a run. Henry was hardly surprised to learn Meredith and Katrina had already gotten in Katrina's rental car and sped off. There might as well have been skid marks on the road that ran through the security gate. The royal family's vehicles were kept in the royal mews, and a few palace guests were allowed to keep cars in the basement garage. The guard at the gate side-eyed Mike as Mike plowed past him, but didn't say anything as Henry hurried in pursuit. Mike walked fast, his phone in his hand, furiously stabbing at the screen with his thick pointer finger. Henry scrambled after him. "Katrina probably made a manicure appointment or something," Mike said. "Has a whole staff of cosmologists, but still likes to sneak out to the places that'll do your nails for $10. "Cosmetologists," said Henry. "Huh?" "You said cosmologists, and they study the cosmos. People who work with cosmetics are cosmetologists." Mike rolled his eyes. "Whatever, Hank. You want to find them? Don't argue with me." "Don't call me Hank. My name is Henry." Mike shrugged and held his phone up to his ear. After a moment he said, "Listen, Katrina, Half of London is going to come looking for you if you don't check in with me immediately." He pulled the phone away and stabbed at it again. "She's not answering. Clearly." Henry made his voice sound sardonic, but inside he was roiling. He'd failed at the one thing he was supposed to do today. If Meredith had truly taken off, the wedding was ruined. And somehow fixing this was in the hands of this large American man in leather. Henry's heart beat with the repeated litany of everything he'd done wrong that day, and how much trouble he was in. On the list of offenses that would get him sacked, losing the bride was pretty far up there. Henry's boss was known as the Royal Butler, the official etiquette expert for the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. As the assistant to the Royal Butler, Henry's task was to make sure the bride and her entourage were schooled in the ways of royal protocol. Unofficially, he was supposed to be keeping an eye on the bride. The Royal Butler, who had been working with Meredith since before the engagement had been announced, was convinced she had cold feet. Why the Royal Butler could not be Meredith's keeper himself was an open question, though Henry supposed he had more pressing matters to attend to, like making sure the royals didn't embarrass themselves too badly at the event. The day had not been going well in that regard. Even before Meredith pulled a disappearing act, one of the prince's Scottish cousins had, as was his wont, wandered off. Pulling off a royal wedding felt like plate spinning. "All right," said Mike, placing his large, warm hands on Henry's shoulders and pulling him slightly out of his panic. Mike gave Henry's shoulders a quick squeeze before releasing him, then counted items on his hand. "She could have gone to a beauty appointment or whatever at some normal hole-in-the-wall salon. Katrina loves to do shit like that. Drives me crazy, because you never know what sort of fans will find her there. A couple of years ago, a woman off a rocket tried to stab Katrina with a nail file." Henry blanched. "There are hundreds of salons in London." "I know." Mike pressed his lips together again and looked around. "They also could have gone shopping. Katrina was talking this morning about not getting Meredith a proper wedding present. They talked about going to buy lingerie or something." "That seems like a clue." "Meredith said no, that it would be too public. She gets mobbed everywhere she goes in London, you know. So wherever they are, they're lying low, or we'd have heard by now." Mike stared at his phone for a beat. "I can call the rental car company and see if they can activate the tracker on the car, and tell me where she parked, which would narrow it down. For all I know, they're on the way to the airport." That was a possibility Henry wasn't ready to contemplate. He hadn't thought from his interactions with Meredith that there was any reluctance to marry Prince Richard, but maybe she was a good actress. On the other hand, his boss had suspected Meredith had cold feet, and perhaps he was right. "Do you think Miss Bast could have been the one who wanted to leave?" "Hell if I know. But that leads to the other issue here. Meredith's ex-husband is in town. I saw it on some gossip site this morning." "So she could have run off with her ex. Lovely." Mike took a step away and dialed a number on his phone again. Henry ran all of the possibilities in his mind. All of them were bad. If they went somewhere public, Henry's boss would surely find out he'd lost track of her. If they were hiding somewhere, Henry would never be able to find her. And if Meredith had run off with her ex while on Henry's watch... But somehow, Mike's command of the situation was keeping him from total panic. "Yes, thank you," Mike said to the person on the other end of the call. He started walking and motioned for Henry to follow, the phone still pressed to his ear. "Look, maybe she's just a goof who forgot where she parked and this is nothing, but in the event it was stolen, I'd like to keep it quiet, because of the wedding and all. So if you can track it down, I'll go take a look. I assume it's better for you to get the car back and not have to file an insurance claim." "Uh-huh." "Oh, that's great, Eddie. You're a lifesaver." "Sure, the number is..." After Mike rattled off his phone number, he hung up and turned triumphantly to Henry. "I know a guy at the car rental agency. Perk of renting from a big agency is my guy back in the States can get access to any car the agency rents out. Katrina's car got a low jack on it, so he'll be able to find out where it is. He said he'd text me with the location as soon as he has it." "Enterprising of you." Mike narrowed his eyes. "I can't tell if you're being sarcastic or British." "You just lied to your friend." Mike's phone chimed. He glanced at the screen. "I just found the princess-to-be. Let's go." Mike walked over to a motorcycle. He opened a compartment under the seat and pulled out a helmet, which he tossed to Henry. "Are we riding that monstrosity?" Henry blustered. "Yes. You ever ridden on a bike like this before?" No. Mike smirked. "Are you afraid of motorcycles?" or just afraid of rubbing up against me? A bit of both, if Henry was being honest. But he said, I'm not afraid. Great. Mike pulled out his own helmet and put it on before shutting the compartment. He straddled the bike. Hop on. Christ! Henry took a deep breath and climbed on behind Mike. Mike's body was huge, his leather-clad shoulders looming before Henry. Better hold on. Traffic's a bitch out there. So I might have to make some tactical maneuvers to get around it. And before you give me a lecture about obeying traffic laws, if I do that, Kat and Meredith will be gone before we get to them. Fine. Henry tentatively put his hands on Mike's waist. No, really grab on. You'll topple off if you give me that delicate touch. Henry took another deep breath and put his arms around Mike's middle. He smelled of warm leather and musky man. Henry paused to inhale. The scent was intoxicating. He sighed into it and tried to relax, at which point he realized Mike was chuckling. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Henry asked. A little. Then he revved the engine. Mike. The rental car was parked near 7 Dials in Covent Garden. It wasn't parked well either. Part of the bumper jutted out into the narrow street, which would surely cause someone to plow right into it. Mike wedged the bike behind the rental car and killed the engine. He waited a moment for Henry to get off, but instead Henry continued to grasp Mike's torso as if his life depended on it. Mike laughed and peeled Henry's hands from his waist. He had to admit he was reluctant to do so. Having Henry's thin but surprisingly toned arms wrapped around him had made him feel like a superhero. Give me the helmet, and then find out where someone might go for a manicure around here. Henry wordlessly removed the helmet and handed it over. Then he pulled out his phone. Mike looked around as he put the helmets back into their compartment. It looked like a ritzy neighborhood. Mike didn't know London at all. He'd been here when Katrina had been on tour, but he'd really only seen hotels and arenas. There's a salon on Monmouth Street, Henry said, his voice still a little shaky. Just over that way. We'll start there, but keep your eyes open. Plenty of storefronts here. Look inside, but don't be obvious about it. Yes, of course. Mike laughed. Henry was so very proper, but riding on the motorcycle seemed to have put him in a kind of shock. And, okay, Mike had driven rather aggressively, but they'd found the car, hadn't they? When Mike and Henry walked into the salon, all eyes were immediately on them. They were an odd pair, and neither really had any business in a salon. Mike's hair had been cut short recently, and as he appraised Henry, he noted that not a hair on his head was out of place. It was a different look than Mike's biker leathers, for sure, but the effect was kind of sexy in a buttoned-up sort of way. Pulling his eyes away from Henry, he quickly realized that Katrina and Meredith were not there. Mike approached the receptionist. Now was not the time to pussyfoot around. He wanted answers. We need to know if someone was here. The receptionist's eyes went wide. Are you a Bobby? Because if not, we don't share client information. Henry held up a hand and motioned for Mike to back off before approaching the receptionist. Yes, hello, sorry. Looking for my wife. I lost track of her while we were shopping. But I believe she had an appointment today. Samantha? And may I say what a charming blouse you're wearing? Mike grunted, but the receptionist beamed. This is my wife's cousin from America. Forgive him. The receptionist smiled and looked down at the appointment book. Samantha did have an appointment, but she left about half an hour ago. Mike wondered if Samantha had been a lucky guess, or if Henry had managed to peek at the appointment book. Sneaky bastard. Although he had to admit, he was impressed by Henry's foppish charm. Oh, bollocks, Henry said. Well, she's around here somewhere. Dreadfully sorry to have bothered you. I'm surprised she didn't text you. We had quite an afternoon here, said the receptionist. I had my mobile off. Henry pulled a phone out of his pocket and flashed it at the receptionist. Why? What happened? The receptionist smiled widely and went all twinkly-eyed. Oh, Meredith Bast was here, and Katrina Ledoux. They came here to a regular salon? Henry did a fair job of sounding completely scandalized. They must have their own staff to do their nails. They do. Apparently this is just a thing Katrina likes to do. Oh, I'd like to get a look at Meredith. I've heard she's gorgeous up close. She is! She said they were going lingerie shopping. Maybe I'll go buy my wife something nice and see who I run into. Thank you immensely. I'm glad you all had a great afternoon. Henry smiled, shook the receptionist's hand and beckoned for Mike to follow him out the door. Once they were back outside, Mike said, "If you're married to a woman, I'm the queen. You do things your way, I'll do them mine." Henry sauntered away a little, proud of himself now. If you'd had your way, you would have bullied the poor receptionist and she never would have volunteered any information. "Look up lingerie stores." Mike pointed at Henry's phone, which was still in his hand. "No need. There's only one worth going to in this neighborhood, if you're about to get married and have money to burn," said Henry. "It's right up this way." Mike held back on commenting on Henry's knowledge of lingerie stores. Thinking about it made Mike's brain short-circuit. Suddenly he pictured Henry out of his stuffy suit and in. Henry's body was probably strong in a wiry way, or lean muscles, maybe some wispy blonde hairs on his chest. Mike could just picture the way he'd bite his lip and moan as Mike. Nope, they had to find Meredith and Katrina. Henry led Mike into... Well, it wasn't like any lingerie store Mike had ever seen. Not that he'd been in many. The walls were a deep red. Gold mannequins held court across the store, all of them draped in lacy bras and panties, and... Oh, there was a painting of a woman tied up and blindfolded behind the registers. Next to it, disembodied hands mounted on the wall held whips and floggers. Near that, there was a glass case full of gleaming vibrators. "Where did you bring me?" Mike whispered. Henry didn't answer, but he seemed to be looking around intently. Right. They were supposed to be searching for Katrina and Meredith. "Henry?" Mike turned and saw a tall black woman with a riot of dark, curly hair approaching. They air-kissed each other's cheeks. "So nice to see you," the woman said. "And quite prescient. The items you ordered came in, but I haven't had time to call you yet." She looked past Henry to Mike. "Oh, and who is this? New boyfriend?" Henry's face darkened a little. He was likely blushing, but it was hard to tell in the boudoir lighting of the store. Not exactly. This is Mike, relative of a friend of mine. I'm just showing him around town." "I'm Jenna, by the way. Lovely to meet you." Mike barely registered what she said. If merely wondering about Henry and lingerie stores had short-circuited Mike's brain, trying to imagine what items he'd ordered very well could lead to a complete meltdown. "You still there, Mike?" Henry asked. "Sorry, don't spend a lot of time in lingerie stores. This is a lot. You're a regular here?" Henry shrugged. "I wouldn't go that far." Mike started to gather his wits. "No, I understand what's going on here. You're so very proper when you're at work, but you let loose at night, don't you?" Henry rolled his eyes. "That's exactly it, isn't it? No one can be that stiff all the time. Gentlemen in the streets. All right, that's enough," said Henry. The saleswoman gave Mike a once-over. "Maybe you should give this guy a chance, Henry. He's kinda hot. Looks like he walked out of a leather bar." "How do you know I didn't bring him in here to pick out something for his girlfriend back home?" The woman raised an eyebrow. "Please." It was Mike's turn to roll his eyes. "Hey, listen, we don't have a lot of time to—" Henry held up his hand. "I heard Katrina Ledoux came in here earlier today. Did you see her?" "Oh, yeah. You didn't know? She was here with Meredith Bast. They bought this little purple lace teddy for Meredith, and then a little something for her lover." She winked. "I thought you were working with Meredith." "Not today. I haven't had the chance to meet Katrina yet. I didn't realize they were together today." Mike was impressed by how well Henry was keeping his cool through this. He barely looked ruffled. Mike suspected this was a duck-on-a-pond situation, though. Henry was perfectly calm above the surface, but churning underneath. Henry was undeniably charming. The way he smiled at the saleswoman likely got him a few pounds knocked off the price of the mystery items he'd ordered. "You just missed them. She left maybe 5 minutes before you got here," the woman said. Shit. This wild goose chase would likely take all afternoon. On the way back to the bike, Henry let his guard down and started rambling about losing Meredith again. "I'll be fired, and the wedding will be ruined." "Nice to see your priorities are in order." Henry huffed. I did not sign up for running all over London trying to track down these women. Me neither, and yet here we are. They walked silently for a few paces. Then Mike said, You know, you were appalled by my lying to the car rental guy, but you just lied all over this neighborhood. I was just following your example, not lies, a little subterfuge. Right, of course. When I fudge the truth to get a lock on Kat's car, it's a lie. But when Mr. Proper pretends to be married to a woman or not minding Meredith today, it's a little subterfuge. Mike laughed as Henry looked around. Any other brilliant ideas? Does Katrina perhaps enjoy French pastries or expensive perfume? Mike couldn't think of anything. The woman at the lingerie store hadn't known where they'd gone either. No, and the car was gone. Henry. Mike had apparently asked his friend to notify him if the car changed locations, because he immediately received a text saying the car was on the move, headed west. I suppose it's not too much to hope that they're headed back toward the palace, Henry said, eyeing the motorcycle. He wasn't eager to get back on it. Riding behind Mike had been thrilling in some ways. Mike was warm and sexy and smelled fantastic. But Mike also drove like a lunatic, and Henry had legitimately feared for his life. Should we wait for them to stop or just follow them? Mike asked. Can you drive a motorcycle and look at a phone at the same time without plowing into a building and killing us both? Maybe not. Any better ideas, Hank? Given that they can't get anywhere fast at this time of day in London, we could probably walk back to the palace faster than they could drive there. We could wait to see if they park again, then go after them. We might catch them this time. And that death machine you ride around on is faster than a car at least. Henry didn't like the idea of waiting, but moving might separate them further. The ladies were headed west now, but what if they turned in a different direction? And don't call me Hank. I don't like waiting, but I guess I see why it's smart. Mike picked up his phone and started stabbing the screen with his fingers again. Then he lifted the phone to his ear. Katrina, don't know what you're trying to pull, but this is not funny. Call me back immediately, Mike said. I've texted her half a dozen times. The phone rings for a while before going to voicemail. So she's got it turned on. She's deliberately ignoring me. Don't you hate when people ignore you? Asked Henry with a raised eyebrow. Is this about your lectures about which fork goes in which hand? It's not 1874. Calling some stuffy duke my lord instead of your grace is hardly going to cause an international incident. Henry took a deep breath. Those things were important, as part of the greater scheme of royal protocol. I realize these things may seem inconsequential to you as an American, but they're part of tradition. We've been doing some of these things for hundreds of years. It's not about which fork to use, it's about respecting the sovereign and honoring British history. Buckingham Palace, for example, is more than 300 years old, and we honor everything that has happened in the palace by following certain protocol. Mike stared at him for so long that Henry found it unnerving. You really care about this stuff, Mike finally said. I really do. I realize how silly it must seem, but it is important. I suppose, if you put it that way. Mike tilted his head. I didn't realize how deep all this went. Yes, well. Henry trailed off. Mike was looking at him with such sincerity. Henry had initially pegged him as hunky, but perhaps not very deep. But Mike's level-headedness had surprised him today, and yes, he was quite sexy. Probably I seem ridiculous to you too. I'm just a big oaf, right? All right, fine. We may have misjudged each other at first meeting. I'm not searching for compliments. Henry sighed. I'm sure you're very good at what you do. You seem like a strong fellow. Mike laughed. Right. There is a little bit more to being a bodyguard than just brute strength, especially with a charge like Katrina. You gotta think on your feet. You have to be strategic too. Henry looked Mike up and down. Mike was a good-looking guy, with bulging muscles, a Vin Diesel type but with hair. But more than that, he seemed safe. And Henry would get back on that motorcycle to take off after Meredith and Katrina, because for all the reckless driving, Henry trusted Mike to keep him safe. Katrina must have too, despite ditching him today. There was some value in that. If I called you a big oaf, I apologize." Mike smiled. "Accepted. Sorry for thinking you have a stick up your ass. I mean, you definitely do. But if what the sales lady at the lingerie store said was true, I bet you like having—" "I beg you not to complete that sentence!" Henry was still mortified by Jenna's big mouth back at the lingerie store. He didn't need Mike piling on. Mike leaned his head back and bellowed out a laugh. "I'm glad you're amused," said Henry. "We seem to be having a moment. I didn't want it to get too serious." "A moment?" "This is the part in the movie where the two people who have completely misunderstood each other up to this point come to an understanding. Next thing you know, we'll be kissing." Henry scoffed, though he wasn't altogether opposed to the idea of kissing Mike. But he said, "Perish the thought. I mean, unless you want to kiss me. It might not even be terrible. I'm a pretty good kisser. Just saying." Henry found himself leaning closer to Mike, tempted to prove or disprove him. But then Mike's phone chimed. "They've parked on Brewer Street." Mike showed Henry his phone. Henry shook his head to regain his composure. He looked at the phone, which showed a map with a little red dot indicating the car's location. "That's near Piccadilly Circus." "They aren't. They wouldn't." "What?" "It's tourist central. I thought you said Katrina knew better than to go somewhere crowded, that Meredith didn't like crowds." Was Henry really referring to the bride as Meredith instead of Miss Bast now? He'd definitely been spending too much time with Mike. "Those idiots." Mike pulled out the helmets. "Now I want to find Katrina so I can kill her." Mike. "So, this is Times Square," Mike said. As they stood in front of a huge, lit billboard and gazed at the swarms of people milling around, Mike felt deeply uncomfortable. He hated big crowds because they multiplied the odds that if something went wrong, people would get hurt. Worse, finding Katrina here would be like finding a needle in a haystack. "What?" Henry asked in his polished, proper way, overpronouncing the T. "Times Square, New York City? Lots of lights, lots of out-of-towners?" "Oh, yes, I suppose so." "I fucking hate Times Square." "I'm no fan of Piccadilly." This place was giving Mike flashbacks. He'd been out of the army for nearly a decade, but he'd done a couple of tours in Iraq, and part of his job had been to coordinate missions into towns and cities where the potential for fuck-ups was high. Between his own team, resistance fighters, Al-Qaeda wannabes and civilians, plus the goddamned heat, there had always been so much going on that Mike had needed to be mindful of. His experience in the army made him good at his job now. But all these people were overwhelming him. How the hell were they supposed to find Meredith and Katrina? "This is a fool's errand," Henry said. "They could be anywhere." Mike pulled out his phone and did a quick online search. There were some social media reports that Meredith had been spotted near a giant billboard, which Mike supposed was the building he was staring at, covered in giant signs advertising chain stores and banks. Then they'd been seen walking into a shoe store on Glasshouse Street. "Glasshouse Street?" Mike asked. "We're on it," said Henry. Well, fuck. Mike sensed they'd already missed the women, but he scanned the crowd anyway. He turned around and found himself staring at a shoe store, but there were only a handful of customers inside, and none of them was Meredith or Katrina. Mike turned around again and looked until he began to feel overwhelmed. "This is the worst day ever," said Henry. "We'll find them," said Mike, though he did not feel very confident about that. But he had an urge to console Henry. "Katrina does shit like this, but I've never known Meredith to be so irresponsible." Mike closed his eyes for a second and tried to get his bearings. He just had to calm down enough to be logical. When he opened his eyes again, Henry had moved about 2 feet away. "Hello?" Henry said to a couple of 20-something women with their phones in hands. "So, okay, I'm a huge fan of Richard and Meredith. I heard a rumor they came through here just a few minutes ago. Did you see them?" He did a decent approximation of an American accent, like if a guy from Southie moved to California and tried to talk like a valley girl. "Oh my god, I love Meredith so much. She's so beautiful," said one of the girls, definitely American. Good guess on Henry's part. "She and Katrina Ledoux totally came through here like 5 or 10 minutes ago." gorgeous. Did you see where they went? I would die if I could get an autograph. The woman nodded, like this was a perfectly normal thing to say, and pointed north, back toward the car. You are adorable, by the way. Where are you from? Mike tuned them out as he tried to work through what had happened. He looked around and spotted a man who looked awfully familiar. Had Mike seen him at the pre-wedding celebration at the palace the night before? But clearly Mike was so desperate he was hallucinating, starting to see royals everywhere. His phone chimed. When he looked, there was a text indicating the car was on the move again. Fuck. The tourist women walked off, chattering some more about how gorgeous Meredith and Katrina were. Henry returned to Mike and said, "What is happening?" in his normal accent. They're headed west again. Back towards the palace? I don't know yet. Mike looked up at Henry's eager face. Those girls were about to adopt you as their personal gay. I know. Creepy. And fruitless, I suppose, if our charges beat us back to the car. Maybe the next stop we should just wait by the car. Perhaps. Mike tried to think of where Katrina and Meredith would go, wanting to anticipate the next move. We haven't considered Meredith's ex. You think she might have met up with him? Or plans to run off? Henry's eyes went wide. You do think that? Mike went to the browser on his phone and did a quick search for the story he'd seen that morning. And okay, he liked browsing the tabloids sometimes. Says here he was spotted near Buckingham Palace. Mike read from the story. Intrepid photographer Gwen Parker snapped a photo of Mr. Nelson, blah, blah. He's believed to be staying at the Grand. Do you know it? Yes, not even half a kilometer that way, Henry pointed. Kilometers, Hank? God save Mike from Europe. Mike's phone chimed again. The car had stopped near the palace, but it looked like they'd pulled into the middle of a building. Where is this? Mike showed Henry the screen. I think that's a car park. Would they park in a public lot? If they didn't want to be found. That's around the corner from the Grand. Henry indicated the hotel's location with his perfectly manicured thumbnail and an expression of deepest concern. This could just be a terrible coincidence. They could have parked in the public lot and gone somewhere else. Hell, they could be back at the palace. Mike redialed Katrina, and she of course did not pick up. Still on the lam, though. We'd better go. It certainly can't hurt to try the hotel. They started walking. I have to get back on the motorcycle, don't I? Does it still scare you? No, Henry said in a way that indicated it definitely did. Just hold me tight, baby. Henry. Katrina's car was in an exorbitantly priced parking garage. Mike parked the bike in the spot next to it like an exclamation point. Henry hugged Mike from behind, his face pressed against Mike's warm leather jacket. He stayed that way, pressed against him, until the rumbling of the motor died out. The rumbling in Henry's body diminished, and then a little while longer, just because it was nice to hold Mike. Henry was so absorbed he failed to realize Mike was saying something. What? Mike twisted around. You okay back there? Henry peeled himself away from Mike and slid off the bike. Yes, sorry. I don't mind. Half the reason I own a bike is so that cute boys will snuggle close behind me as I ride it. But Henry had no clever retort for that. I was just saying I'm tempted to leave Katrina a note under the windshield wiper. That seems awfully conspicuous. Let's just check at the hotel. Maybe pop into a few shops around here. I wish we could put a boot on the car. A what? Do they not do that here? It's like a big lock the cops put on your tires. Oh, getting clamped. Clamped? That's what we call those big lock things. I know the name is a bit ghastly, but... Mike laughed. I love how you say that. Ghastly. Let's go, all right? Henry led the way out of the garage and onto the street. He walked half a block to the Grand, a high-end boutique hotel that catered to wealthy tourists, mostly. Or so Henry suspected. He couldn't imagine wanting to stay so close to such a high-traffic area. Although Henry lived in an apartment in Soho that was across the street from a gay bar, which he supposed other people might find undesirable. He paused at the main door, waiting for Mike to catch up. Mike still looked wildly out of place, even among the motley group of people on the streets. He was too big, too muscular, too tall, and yet surprisingly limber on his feet, and in complete command of his surroundings. He ducked his head as he walked by each storefront, probably trying to see through the windows. "How do you want to play this?" Mike asked when he reached Henry. "Let's try the nice approach." Henry walked into the hotel, Mike on his heels. In the lobby, he spotted a hotel employee in a maroon jacket with the hotel's logo on the breast pocket and walked up to him. "Hello, sir. I was wondering if you could help me with something." The man smiled. "Of course. Are you a guest?" No. I'm looking for a guest." "I'm afraid I can't help you. This hotel values the privacy of its guests. Have a great day." Then the man walked off. Henry watched him go, feeling befuddled. Mike sidled up beside him and cleared his throat. "If someone asks if you're a guest, you say yes." Henry was tired and frustrated now. He wanted to find Meredith and Katrina immediately. "Forget polite. I believe it may expedite matters if you get a little belligerent." Mike grinned. "What is that grin for?" "I just want to put you in my pocket and have you narrate my whole day. You say belligerent, which almost sounds polite. But really, you want me to use a little of the old brawn, get aggressive, intimidate the hell out of a clerk or two." Mike exhaled, his shoulders rising. "All right, I'll go to the front desk and be a bit of a bully. Work for you?" "Quite. Perhaps in more ways than one." Mike said, "Follow my lead," out of the side of his mouth, and nodded toward the front desk. His proximity sent a shiver up Henry's spine. Mike walked up to one of the clerks and leaned on the counter like he owned it and said, "I need some information." The clerk's eyes went wide. He took a step backward. Who are you?" "I'm working security for the wedding. You've got a troublemaker staying here. I'd like a word." The menacing way Mike said it indicated he didn't so much want a word as he wanted to put his fist through someone's face. Yes." The clerk looked alarmed. He stared at Mike for a long moment before he said, "Do you have some sort of identification?" Henry panicked. But Mike apparently had this covered, and without missing a beat he pulled a billfold from his pocket and opened it for the clerk. Henry couldn't see what document Mike showed the clerk, but it did look more official than a driver's license. "Up to. I don't have all day." The clerk stared at the billfold, then shook himself and said, "All right. What's the name?" "Aiden Nelson." The clerk typed at the computer. There's no one here by that name." That finally ruffled one of Mike's feathers. Without taking his elbow off the counter, he straightened a little. "Are you sure?" He spelled the last name. The clerk typed some more. "I'm sure." "African-American man, about 6'2", 230. Tall guy, 16 stone," said Henry. "He's in his early 30s. Cropped hair. Anything?" The clerk shook his head. "I haven't seen anyone like that here, sir." Now Henry panicked. Mike stood up and pulled his phone from his pocket. Henry tried to see if he'd gotten another notification that the car had moved, but Mike shook his head. "Katrina Ledoux hasn't been through here, has she?" Henry asked. The clerk shook his head. "No, I definitely would have remembered seeing Katrina Ledoux. The way I feel is my jam." He gave a little shimmy before clearing his throat and looking down at his computer. "We appreciate it." Mike retreated toward the sofas in the middle of the lobby. Henry followed, his stomach churning now. It was one thing when it felt like they were on the heels of Meredith and Katrina, but now the trail had gone cold. "Am I wrong?" Mike asked, mostly to himself. "About this Nelson bloke, or Katrina, or what?" Mike let out a sigh. "If I'm wrong that Meredith ran off to see her ex, then I'm happy to be wrong. But I don't think we've ruled that out so much as we just got the hotel wrong. And now we're wasting time because they've gone who knows where." Henry dropped down onto the sofa next to Mike and leaned against his warm body. "Has the car moved?" Mike pulled out his phone and swiped at the screen a few times. "No." "She's at least in the neighborhood." "You don't sound convinced." Henry sighed. This had been his one job. Keep an eye on Meredith. And now she was a runaway bride. Optimistically, he still had until the ceremony tomorrow morning to track her down and get her into her dress and into the carriage and to the church on time, but he really needed to find her soon. They'd been trying to track her down for almost 3 hours now, and she'd missed appointments with the jeweler, a representative from the chapel choir about music, and an officer from Scotland Yard who had wanted to go over the security plan for the ceremony. Henry looked down at his phone. He had a bunch of missed calls and a flurry of text messages. Then his phone rang. It was his boss. Bollocks. "Hello, Mr. Holland." Mike raised an eyebrow. On the phone, Henry's boss said, "I just got a call from the royal jeweler who tells me you're appallingly late for your appointment." "Yes, I will call her to apologize. I'm terribly sorry, but the bride has been a bit difficult. Wants to do things her way. Obstinate Americans and all that." There, that sounded somewhat convincing. "Mrs. Whittaker will be at the palace until this evening, so please let her know when the bride makes herself available. I want to be sure all this goes off without a hitch." "Yes, of course, sir. Again, so sorry for the delay." It had been a polite conversation, but the subtext was clear. Get this done, or you're fired. "I'm so fired," Henry told Mike. "Not if we find her," Mike said, jumping up. "Where do we even look now?" Mike glared at Henry for a moment. Then he looked around. He seemed to be mulling something over. "Let's go outside, back to the bike. Maybe if we do just wait by the car, they'll turn up." Henry took a deep breath and followed Mike. He took one step outside, and then the heavens opened. Rain in London was hardly rare, but this was something else entirely. A thick curtain of water cascading over everything in sight. Before Henry could even react to it, he was already drenched. "That's it," he cried. "I'm done. I'll lose my job, but I don't even care anymore. I can't keep chasing these women across London." "Henry, don't just stand there and say my name." Henry had to shout to be heard over the rain. If everyone had just done what they were supposed to." He shook his head. "Christ, this has been one of the worst days of my life." Then as fast as the rain fell, or Henry blinked, Mike swooped in and kissed him. The world stopped turning. Mike's lips were wet and warm, and the stubble on his face was scratchy. But kissing him was perfect. Henry melted against him, pressing his hands against Mike's smooth leather jacket, licking his tongue out to taste Mike. Everything, the rain, Meredith, royal protocol, faded away except for the press of Mike's lips against his own. As they broke apart, he looked to Mike for some sort of explanation, but Mike just stood there with a goofy half smile on his face. "Why did you do that?" "I wanted to," Mike shrugged, still smiling. "Look, there's a bar right there. Let's go in. I'll buy you a drink, you can yell some more, we'll dry off, then we'll regroup and figure out what to do next. All right?" Henry turned and looked behind him. He felt dazed, off his axis from the kiss. But indeed there was a bar with a big sign over it that said, "The Hound," next to the image of a stately corgi. He didn't need reminders of work right now, but it looked warm and dry. "All right." Mike took Henry's hand and led him inside. He gestured toward a couple of empty stools, so they sat side by side at the bar. It was crowded and loud. There was probably a football game on. Henry didn't care. Suddenly all he wanted in the world was a glass of wine the size of his head. "You called me Henry," he said after they ordered. "It's your name, isn't it?" "You've been calling me Hank all day." Mike grinned. "Because it riles you up. I like riling you up." "Oh." Mike leaned close. "Maybe once we find our rogue women, we can go back to my hotel, and I can find some new ways to rile you up." An electric shock went up Henry's spine. He felt heat flood his face. "Oh." Mike leaned away. "If it makes you feel better, my real name is Michelangelo." The shock of that made Henry laugh. "Really? On my ID and everything." Mike took a sip of his beer. "I'm an Italian boy from Brooklyn. Grew up with a Catholic mama who could make the Pope feel guilt and who still puts red gravy in every dish she cooks." "That's delightful." "What about you? Are you from London?" "Yes. I grew up in a neighborhood far less posh than the ones we've seen today. But my mother was a secretary for the Prince of Wales in the 70s, so I had some familiarity with the royal family. Then I enrolled in this etiquette class on a whim. The teacher was the man who is now my boss." Mike nodded, but didn't have the opportunity to respond. There was some sort of commotion toward the back of the bar. Henry didn't want to know. The bartender had just plunked a glass of Merlot in front of him, and Henry reached for it. But Mike turned his head toward the noise and said, "You have got to be fucking kidding me." "What is it?" asked Henry, not looking away from his wine. "Meredith and Katrina." Henry looked up, and sure enough, in the back corner of the bar, Meredith held court, Katrina at her side. A group of people surrounded them, smiling and laughing, as if Meredith were not currently the most famous woman in Britain and not getting married tomorrow. Mike was off his stool and headed for them before Henry had put his glass back down. Henry gave one last longing look at his wine before he slid off his own stool and ran after Mike. When he caught up, Mike was saying, "God damn it, Katrina! I've been looking for you all afternoon." Katrina shrugged, as if this didn't bother her in the least. "We just wanted to have some fun." They'd changed clothes since Henry had last seen them. Katrina wore a glittery blue sheath dress with a high neckline, designed to show off her miles-long legs. Meredith's bright red dress showed off quite a bit of cleavage, but it was just short of vulgar. She crossed her legs primly, all the better to show off the matching red heels she wore. "This is my last day of freedom," said Meredith. "Oh, hello, Henry." "You couldn't return one of my calls or texts to tell me you were okay?" Mike asked Katrina. Meredith sighed. The crowd around her, perhaps sensing that this was not a public conversation, or perhaps just taking in how intimidating Mike was in full bodyguard mode, began to back off and retreat to other corners of the bar. "I didn't want you to find us, all right?" said Meredith. "Look, tomorrow I'm marrying into one of the most high-profile families in the world. I love Richard, and I want to marry him, but it's like I'm about to go into a convent. Henry here can tell you all about how proper everything is. I've had to change the way I dress, the way I act in public. I can't do anything that will bring shame to the family. And I'm okay with that. I am. It's time for the next phase in my life. But I just wanted one more taste of what my old life was like before I committed to the new one." "So you hopped out a window?" asked Henry. "There was no way you'd let me leave. You dragged me to some, I don't know, hat fitting or etiquette lesson to tell me I wasn't bowing at the right angle." Mike chuckled. Henry glared at him until he stopped. Mike looked back at Meredith. "Why drive all over London, though? Or come to some pub like this?" "Katrina never got me a wedding present, but wanted to. So we got mani-pedis. Then we went to this lingerie shop that's supposed to be the most luxurious one in London. Also, kind of naughty, eh?" Meredith winked at Katrina. "So we did a little shopping," said Katrina. "We saw your motorcycle before we left. Subtle. You having our car tracked?" asked Katrina. "I had Eddie connect me to the LoJack." Mike said this in a flat tone as if it were no big deal. "I figured." Katrina rolled her eyes. "Anyway, then I got a call that the necklace I ordered to wear tomorrow was finally ready to pick up at this little jeweler near Piccadilly Circus, so we went over there. Then we drove back here, but Katrina didn't want to park in the Mews just yet, so we found a spot in a public lot and decided to get one last drink before we went back to the palace." Everyone spoke breezily, as if none of this were part of the dynasty-ruining crisis Henry had been chasing all day. It annoyed him that everyone was acting so blasé about everything. Apparently it annoyed Mike, too, because his tone was terse and irritable as he said, "What about Aiden?" "What about him?" asked Meredith. "I saw in a tabloid this morning that he's in town, and I worried maybe you'd gone back to him." "To Aiden?" Meredith asked, as if this were absurd. "No, not at all. But I'll see him tomorrow." "You will?" asked Henry. "Of course. We're divorced, but we're still friends. I invited him. He's a guest. He's bringing that blonde wisp of an actress he's dating now as his +1. But some things can't be helped. But good God, no. I would never get back together with him. I do love Richard, you know. I'd have to in order to make all these changes in my life for him." Henry let out a breath. This whole long crisis was over, he supposed. He glanced at Mike, who still looked rather furious. He took a deep breath and said, "We should probably go back after everyone finishes this round." Meredith muttered, "I suppose it couldn't last all night." Henry knew the feeling. He glanced at Mike. worried that now that they'd accomplished their goal, the magic he'd felt spark between them might disappear. Mike. Sneaking Meredith back into the palace proved to be more difficult than sneaking out. By the time they left the bar, the rain had stopped and the streets had dried as though the deluge had never happened. When they arrived back, the palace guards with the big hats, Mike couldn't remember what they were called, were undergoing a shift change. The guard posted at the family entrance to the palace recognized Meredith, Katrina, and Henry, but didn't know Mike and was reluctant to let him in until Mike produced 2 forms of ID and Katrina vouched for him repeatedly. But once everyone was inside, Mike felt better about everything. He'd been able to get the change of clothes he'd left with Katrina, and now that he was dry, he went off in search of Henry. Mike found him in a ceremonial room, talking to a frumpy older woman who looked like a kindly British nanny out of central casting. Meredith stood beside the woman, wearing a pretty tiara on her head.
"That's the one," said the woman. "Prince Albert helped design it, you know. It was one of Queen Victoria's favourites."
"It's lovely," said Meredith, sounding genuine. She'd changed clothes. Earlier in the day, she'd been dressed like the Meredith whom Mike had known for years, in a bright red dress that hugged her body. Meredith was the master of sexy, but classy. But now she looked a little mumsy in a blue dress with a high neckline and a flared skirt. Meredith was still a stunning woman, and the dress was chic and beautiful, but the royal drag almost made her look like a different person. Her current wardrobe was nothing like the crazy costumes she'd worn on stage when she'd been on tour. Perhaps she had deserved a little fun before her matrimonial commitment to this family. Mike caught Henry's eye and crooked his finger.
"If you'll excuse me,"
Henry said. He was still wearing the same grey suit he'd had on all day, though it was wrinkled now. Henry stepped into the hallway and gestured for Mike to follow him, away from the door.
"What is it?"
Henry asked.
"Katrina and I are headed back to our hotel shortly. I wanted to see you again."
Henry smiled faintly. "We did have quite an adventure today. I suppose it's over now?" Mike tilted his head, confused.
"Why does it have to be?"
"What do you mean?"
"Well, first of all, I'll see you at the wedding tomorrow, won't I?"
"I suppose so. I plan to be there." Mike nodded.
"I don't know what you're up to after that, but I'm here in London for 10 more days. Katrina's doing a concert at Wembley next Friday. Then, who knows? Katrina's talking about moving here long term. Something about Meredith needing a connection to her old life. So as far as I can tell, nothing needs to be over."
"Are you suggesting we date?" Henry asked, sounding surprised. Mike chuckled.
"How about dinner and see where things go?"
Henry stared for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Let me just finish up here. Tell me where you're staying and I'll be there tonight with bells on." Mike programmed his phone number into Henry's phone and leaned down to give Henry a peck on the cheek. But Henry did him one better, turned his head and kissed Mike full on the lips, right there in the middle of the palace. A passing footman gasped softly before quickly carrying on with his business. Mike closed his eyes and leaned into the kiss, enjoying the taste of Henry, the way Henry molded his body to Mike's, the potential here to completely undo a man who was otherwise so buttoned up. It was heady, arousing, warm, and Mike wanted it to go on forever. But he pulled away slightly.
"We have to stop kissing like this. It's going to become a habit."
"I'm all right with that."
"Mr. Stockbridge!"
came a holler from the room Henry had just been in.
"I need you!"
Henry took a step back and yanked on the edges of his suit jacket to get it to fall into place.
"Well, I better get back to it.
Tonight, though." Mike couldn't keep the smile off his face. Tonight.
You're listening to Royally Yours by Kat McMurray, starring Lorna Bennett and Gary Furlong. Produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Realm, listen away. Royally Yours is created by Megan Frampton and written by Megan Frampton, K.M. Jackson, Falguni Kothari, Liz Maverick, and Kat McMurray. It is produced by Lydia Shama and executive produced by Julian Yap and Molly Barton. Audio production, sound design, editing, and theme music by Amanda Rose Smith.